So I had an interesting week. I was at a conference on Thursday where the keynote speaker was George Brooks, and on Wednesday I had a meeting with some trainers about using the Moxie and NIRS and taking muscle oxygen measures. And interesting was the contrast between the 2 days. So you get a world famous professor from Berkeley, George Brooks, talking about contemporary physiology. And you have trainers who are using, and I have this a lot, kind of basic language or basic understanding of physiology. And there's still a big divide there between what contemporary physiology tells us and let's say the terminology that trainers use. So there's a little difference between terminology and actual effectiveness of training. So I understand that. I'm not trying to ivory tower this. But there is a discrepancy there, and I think it's important that we actually try to solve this. And most of it has to do with two words that are very often used that are just flat out wrong. So the word anaerobic and the word alactic. And I'm going to try to quickly explain these points and then tie it into why it makes me so excited about NIRS and why I think there's so much potential in NIRS. The 2 points, anaerobic and alactic. Anaerobic would imply the absence of oxygen, and alactic would imply the absence of lactate. Now, both of the words make no sense, which ties back into the George Brooks presentation that I was talking about. But not just George Brooks. There's a lot of good research from good institutions. So Conant and Schulman and Gladden. So please go take a look at those papers. They're out there. You can read them. A lot of them, there's free access to them. And they've been around for a long time. So Brooks is research in the 80s. So this isn't new in a sense, but just it takes a long time to get information out. The fact is that there is no such thing as anaerobic. The muscle is always highly aerobic, and lactate is produced in completely aerobic environments all the time. Okay, so there is no anaerobic and there is no alactic, because lactate's always being produced and oxygen is always available. So those two words make no sense, and if you're going to want to use the physiology of those words to create some kind of training program, you're going to run into a wall because they're just not true. Now, you may use the word anaerobic to describe intensity. Okay, you're not going to be making that big of a mistake from an intensity point of view. Usually anaerobic just means high intensity. Nonetheless, we should just use the term then, high intensity. Use a performance term. You don't have to use a physiological term to describe those kinds of trainings, especially because the physiological term is inaccurate. To underline that those 2 points are wrong, so there's a lot of papers you can read, like I said, that go into a lot of very detailed experiments that show this. There's also some very basic things that you can think about that make no sense in the line of reasoning behind anaerobic and alactic. And please also go look at the experiments done in the early 20th century by Meyerhoff, for example, how they came up with the term anaerobic. And you'll quickly see the limitations of those experiments, let's say. Again, it was a long time ago, so it was great work done then, but we progress. One of the points, simple contradiction points that I never really understood, and this was at the beginning of my university days, is if high intensity is anaerobic, why do you have your highest VO2 at the highest intensity? Your VO2 doesn't peak out at, let's say, an aerobic capacity and then drops off as you go anaerobic. It doesn't happen. That would be point number one. The point number two is I realized when doing mountain climbing and going to high altitudes where my SpO2 on a simple SpO2 measure will go down significantly and I'd be fatigued. But I would not have any lactate. I would measure lactate and my lactate values would all be below 2. But if I was running at sea level at high intensity, my SpO2 would be high, my 99%, but my lactate would be 12. And then, now this isn't a deal breaker, but it's confusing, and it is labeled the lactate paradox. If you have a paradox in a model, that means your model is incomplete or inaccurate. Because there's no paradoxes. It just means we don't know. A paradox is something we don't know. But if your model is a paradox, you better look at your model and try to fix it. And the final point maybe is, if you've played around with your diet or sugar, or you've played around with lactate measurements and food, you can manipulate lactate values quite easily. So, you know, eating high carb, high sugary foods, you'll have higher lactate values. And if you basically deplete carbs, you will generally have lower lactate values. You tend to have lower, well, not always, but often athletes are at least used to carbs. Depending on who the athlete is, they'll have lower performance with lower carbs too. It's not always the case. It kind of depends on the people. I don't want to get into the diet part. Nonetheless, the point is that lactate can be manipulated. It doesn't have anything to do with oxygen being present or not. And it's always present. So that goes to those 2 points. Alactic and anaerobic are nonsensical terms, and we should try to not use them because they're just wrong. And we have terms to use. You know, we can use performance-based terms, and that's fine. Then to tie it all back into why I'm excited about NIRS is because NIRS doesn't contradict. So what we see with NIRS does not contradict contemporary physiology. What we see with NIRS is, first of all, NIRS is supposed to be measuring your muscle oxygenation, which by definition, if everything is aerobic, is a very important measure because it's the main component of your bioenergetics is your availability, or basically your ability to supply oxygen and your ability to utilize and extract that oxygen in your muscle. And that's exactly what NIRS does. And it also shows us that NIRS will show us that you are always supplying oxygen and you're always using oxygen. So if something is at high intensity, which would have been anaerobic, meaning oxygen is not available or it's not being used, it's not present, well, NIRS doesn't show that. NIRS shows there's lots of oxygen available. Not only that, you're extracting and utilizing much more at high intensity, which would agree with your VO2 being the highest at high intensity. So the measurements we get with NIRS fall much more in line with contemporary physiology than what you would with classical lactate measures. Now, that's, again, if you go back to a video about lactate measures I did earlier, if you think lactate's important, you need to think about why you think it's important, what it says in contemporary physiology, and why you think it's usable, and then you should go measure lactate. But if you think oxygen supply and demand is important, then you probably shouldn't be measuring lactate, or you have to think about why you're going to be measuring your lactate. I hope that's my rambling was okay. I just want, because of that week, I kind of wanted to make those comments, and I hope that helps people, and I hope it helps people understand the potential that NIRS has. Thank you very much. All right, bye.